Hello, everybody. Welcome to this first in a series of Sunday brunches sponsored by the Charleston County Democrats, celebrating Black History Month. We have with us here today Dr. Valerie Frazier, who teaches at the College of Charleston. She teaches just about everything. I mean, she teaches first year composition, she teaches American literature, African American literature, ethnic literatures. In her own research, she works on contemporary African Americans. She does post-colonial literature. She studies and writes on women's literature. So, really a wide variety of things with a focus down in African American literature. In addition to all this, what she's working on right now, she's currently working on a book about the critical reception of Gwendolyn Brooks. So Valerie, let me thank you first of all for joining us. I really appreciate you doing the first of these series. I hope I don't screw it up too much, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you. Appreciate
You're
you coming.
welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. So let me just kick things off. And we're here to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. And I know for most people, that's going to resonate a little bit. They might not know tons of it. It was a wonderful flourishing of American culture, a real explosion of music, literature, philosophy, really every branch of intellectual and artistic endeavors. So how did this thing get started? I mean, is there somebody we would credit? I mean, I know there's names like Alan Locke and Claude McKay or Langston Hughes. I mean, we could go on. There's lots of names that we would associate with this. Can you tell us about the beginnings?
Well, it's my pleasure definitely to talk a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. To some, it's known as the New Negro Renaissance. And I think that term kind of encapsulates where you're going with that question, in that once we think about post Reconstruction and the modernist era of the 20th century, there's a reinvention of the African American, and there's a modernity that comes into being existentially. So we've got our architects of the Harlem Renaissance, and those would be, as you alluded to, Elaine Locke, but also W.E.B. Du Bois. And what they focused on is this new generation, jeunesse, as Palmer Hayden really depicts in this picture. It's a rebirth in the 1920s and the 1930s, and it's a part of Northern migration. Well, we have 6 million African Americans in motion, moving from the South to cities like Harlem, Chicago, and St. Louis. And one thing that's very clear is that it's a movement that extends beyond just Harlem, because we've got these renaissances in Chicago, Charleston, all over the country. And it's a renaissance that involves music, literature, art, philosophy. It's a whole new world perspective that these African Americans are bringing to light, and they're sharing with American culture. And some of that newness, as Ezra Pound talks about, make it new. And definitely people like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, they made it new. And we want to think about 1925 as maybe a good year to start, with Elaine Locke publishing an issue, a special issue in Survey Graphic, which later becomes The New Negro. These essays really speak to this modernity, leaving behind some of that sense of desolation that we felt after the Civil War, and grasping onto a new dream. And as Elaine Locke says, the younger generation comes bringing its gifts. They are the first of the Negro Renaissance. Youth speaks, and the voice of the new Negro is heard. So we see their contributions in all aspects of our daily lives, particularly in music with jazz and the blues, and in art. We can't forget that Pablo Picasso had an African period, and paintings like The Three Musicians were inspired by the Harlem Renaissance. In fact, as Henry Louis Gates calls it, the Harlem Renaissance was full of artists who could be called purveyors of cool.
Purveyors of cool. That's right.
I love that.
Yeah, that I had not heard that before. That's
Yeah.
great.
It sounds like
Um,
something that should be on a t-shirt.
yeah, well,
Mhm.
let's put it on and put C of C English department on there.
Yes, yes.
That sounds great.
Mhm,
You're talking about the Great Migration and
mhm,
people leaving South Carolina, for example, and heading up to places like Chicago and New York, and the Harlem Renaissance is really bigger than Harlem itself.
yes.
Um, it's really, I mean, it's kind of ironic, or maybe, I mean, ironic is probably not the right word. It's maybe as a result of this. I mean, this is taking place in the Jim Crow era. I mean, that's really
Yeah.
what
Mhm,
triggers the
mhm.
Great Migration
Oh, yes, that's
is
true.
the
Yes.
the revival of white
Mhm.
supremacy down here in the
Right.
South.
Yeah, you've got that kind of terrorist regime. We think about 1896 and the Plessy versus Ferguson, which kind of codifies separate but equal in the South.
Yeah,
And then that catapults and projects a lot into what we're going to see into the 20th century with
yeah.
African Americans moving constantly any way they could, via car, via train, via boat to the North and the Midwest.
And then they get to a place like Harlem,
Hmm.
and then what happens there? I mean, geographically, I mean, there's something interesting about the place itself and the transformation of Harlem.
Hmm.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, when you think about it, like beginning 20th century, you have about 20,000 African Americans in Harlem. And so it's mostly a place at that time for middle class immigrants. And then you look a few decades later and you have over 400,000 African Americans jam packed in this small section of New York. And you're right, you wonder how. Well, you've got to think about one, racial redlining,
Mhm.
because we cannot say that the North is exempt from separate but equal. So African Americans, no matter how rich or poor they were, when they moved to New York, where they lived was Harlem. And a prime example would be Alelia Walker, who was the daughter of self-made millionaire Madam C.J. Walker, who was born Sarah Breedlove. And she became a patron of the arts of the Harlem Renaissance. But she too, where did she live? She lived in Harlem. And and I'll just show you, that she lived in a beautiful townhouse that was called, interestingly enough, the Dark Tower. That's from a poem from Countee Cullen called From the
Uh,
Dark Tower. So she would be dressed in these gorgeous turbans and these elaborate outfits. And really, she would use her financial wherewithal to
mhm.
sponsor literary salons and parties to would then collectively bring African American intelligentsia together to formulate these various types of arts. And so that I think that was very encouraging. And one critic calls it similar to what we have today in terms of Black Twitter. That place for cultural advocacy was there in Alelia Walker's
So
townhouse.
there's salons where these
Hmm.
intellectuals are getting together.
Yes,
There are clubs, clubs, black-owned
mhm,
businesses. So
yes,
I mean, in many ways, we would think of Harlem almost as a city within a city, right? I mean, it's a black city within New York City. Uh,
yes, that's true. The proximity to Manhattan, we've got to think about that. And there's constant fluidity. Although we do live in an era, where we have restrictions in terms of how people are mingling racially,
mhm.
the Harlem Renaissance brings everyone together because Harlem is where it's at. This is an era where the Negro was quote unquote in vogue. So in the evening times, people would want to come to the speakeasies and to the clubs like the Cotton Club, the Savoy, and their patrons would be oftentimes white, and they would be interested in being a part of this spectacle,
Yeah.
this magical era of the Harlem Renaissance.
So in vogue, and there's a whole wide spectrum of ways to think about that, and different ways that have some exploitative, and
Well,
I
that
think that
is
we would
true.
think of as co-opting culture, but others,
Mhm.
genuine
Yeah, cultural
uh, respect,
appropriation.
and
Hmm.
yeah,
Similar today with like the hip hop generation and what have you, you have that cultural exchange, and appropriation is a part of that. Exoticism.
yeah,
You could think about George Gershwin. He, thinking about Rhapsody in Blue or Porgy and Bess, he would attend those nighttime jam sessions and he would be inspired, and then he would produce commercially successful works
yeah.
based on
Well,
those collaborations.
and I'm glad you're showing us some of the paintings. It's something I don't, as a
Hmm.
professor of literature, I don't often think about or
Hmm.
know about the but beautiful paintings, but the music,
Yes.
as you said. I mean, this is really, maybe the most important influx into American
Hmm.
cultural history.
Very true. And we have Jacob Lawrence's panel 3 here that kind of talks, shows this movement.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So is there? Uh, I mean, you've given us a lot of names and a lot of details, which is wonderful. I wonder if there's a particular. I know you're a professor of literature. Is there a particular writer that you're drawn to? Someone that you love more than anyone else in the Harlem Renaissance that you want to tell us about?
Well, I thought it would be right now a good time to talk about one of our Black women writers who, really defined an era with her two works, Quicksand and Passing. And yet she's one of those artists who have not been discussed as much as we would like. She
Mhm.
hasn't been discussed, maybe sometimes because she's been overshadowed by some as notable as Zora Neale Hurston. Interestingly, Zora Neale Hurston did not produce much during the Harlem Renaissance except for short stories like Sweat
Mhm.
in 1926 in the infamous magazine Fire. But Nella Larsen's novels were produced as a part of the Harlem Renaissance. You
Uh-huh.
see it 28 and 29 before the stock market crash. So in terms of literary production, you see more from Larsen. And now, particularly, a light is being shined upon her because Netflix paid more than $15 million for her movie Passing, which we're going to see in the upcoming month or so.
Yeah.
So
I,
this is a story about women who are passing themselves off as white for
mhm.
the economic and social gain. And so
Yeah.
that speaks some to still the underlying issues of race at play in the Harlem Renaissance. People were surprised that there were Black doctors, Black attorneys,
Mhm.
Black intellectuals now becoming a part of the Black bourgeoisie. And so, in that way, it allows her to mask her identity. And by that, we refer to Irene, who is our protagonist in the story. So, people don't suspect, oftentimes, when she goes out into the public, that she is African American because of, the way that she dresses, very in fashion,
Yeah.
yeah, very in style,
Right.
and also because she is exhibiting, if you think about it, conspicuous consumption. She has
Yes.
the car, she has the house, she has two maids.
Yeah.
So yeah, so therefore this rising Black middle class is allowing for, if you will, this new way of presenting the Negro, the
Yeah.
African American
Do,
in the
do,
urban environment.
do you get a chance to teach either of these novels at the
I teach,
college?
yes, at least once a year. I teach passing. It's a
Yeah.
very appealing book, because of the mystery of people. Is she Black? Is she
Yeah.
white?
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly enough, you have characters who also pass. They're white and they want to
Uh,
pass as Black because of as we talked about, the cultural appropriation. And
yes.
it's so much in vogue to be African American. So you have issues of gender, issues of class, issues of sexual identity, all in play in the novel.
Yeah. And an issue that's come back into the fore in recent years here. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. Well, I know we're running out of time, so let me ask you one last kind of leading question.
Mhm.
As we said, this was maybe the biggest, most influential event in American cultural history. Um, so it has a legacy. obviously. And I know you do a lot of your research in Gwendolyn Brooks. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance and writers that come after the 1920s, you know.
Definitely, definitely. With Gwendolyn Brooks, she had a very intimate, close relationship with writers from the Harlem Renaissance because they saw themselves as mentors to the next generation, to the modernists of mid-century. So Langston Hughes, for example, met Gwendolyn Brooks when she was 16. Can you believe it?
Oh man.
She was brave enough to go up to him when he visited the Metropolitan Church in Chicago and asked him to read her works. And so from there, he was a fan. And so,
Wow.
yeah, he would judge literary contests and, you know, evaluate hers as the top prize.
Yeah.
And he would actually go to her house, like for soul
Yeah.
food dinners.
Yeah.
And she saw him sit with little kids around him because actually his mother, Langston Hughes's mother, was from Chicago. She spent a good deal of time in Chicago. She worked for a milliner as a
Oh.
maid. And so he visited Chicago first in 1918. And so when times hit after the Harlem Renaissance in the 30s and 40s, where did he go? He went to Chicago.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that's where he interacted with a lot of this new generation. Like we think about people like Margaret Walker.
Yeah.
And as we talked about, like my literary inspiration, Gwendolyn Brooks. So he definitely inspired him. And I'll just show a picture of them together because it really makes me smile every time I see them.
Yeah.
She shared a story. When he did leave for Harlem to go back to Harlem, she threw him a going away party. He was in a small kitchenette apartment, a 2-room apartment,
Uh,
and she said she's crowded in 100 people to and then
100 people.
yes to pay
Yeah.
homage to Langston Hughes because
Yeah.
it wasn't just Harlem that loved Langston.
Yeah.
He also belonged to Chicago and the Midwest because he was a Midwesterner based on his birth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I mean, that's one of the amazing things to think back on these. Can you imagine being a fly on the wall in one of these
Mhm.
salons where you have some of the most famous musicians, philosophers, novelists, poets, all getting together and talking. Just thinking
True.
about Gwendolyn Brooks and
Hmm.
Langston Hughes in the same room is really exciting. Yeah,
It blows my mind. Yes.
yeah.
Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall there?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much. I know you're incredibly busy this time of year, so I really
Mhm.
appreciate you taking the time to talk with us
Yes.
about the Harlem
Mhm.
Renaissance and your own research. This has been delightful. Thanks for kicking it off for us, and have a great Black History Month. Thank you, Valerie.
Oh, and thank you for having me. And you enjoy Black History Month, and we'll just maybe learn a little bit about Black history all throughout the entire year.
Yeah, so we should be doing this every Sunday. So 4 Sundays in February, be looking for a release of another 15 to 20-minute video on Black History Month from the Charleston County Democrats. Thanks very much.
Thank you.